All right, here we go. Another show, the Research to Reps Roundtable. I'm your co-host, Pat Ivey, and with me, Dr. Ted Lambrinides. How you doing, Ted?
I'm doing great, Pat. Doing great.
Awesome. Good to see you. Dr. Reimer, what's happening?
Everything's happening right now, doctor. And today I want to introduce Dr. Phillips. I have had the chance to watch Dr. Phillips at different conferences, and since then I've been able to follow some of his research. Dr. Phillips, would you like to briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first, thanks for having me on the show, guys. Real pleasure. I've been a McMaster for 24 years. The work that we do really centers around trying to understand factors that regulate skeletal muscle. We're interested in obviously exercise. I'm in the Department of Kinesiology, but the intersection between exercise and sometimes less exercise, so a disuse scenario, and various nutritional interventions, predominantly around protein. In, I would say, the first half of my career, younger people. And the older I get, it's been more interesting to study older folks as we move towards the second half of my career. So yeah, that's where we are right now.
A quick question: what's the definition of older?
Yeah, that's a good question. This year, the definition of older is somebody who's 57, and next year it'll be 58. That's probably a personal reflection, but no. I mean, I don't know where aging starts or where somebody's older. My kids tell me I'm old, and so I, going by them, anybody that's over the age of 30 is old. So, but with the center I direct here, we say anybody over the age of 55 is we'll call them a senior.
Well, I'll say, I'm 41, and just this past weekend, thank you. Well, we hosted end of season Little League team party, and I was the head coach, and we were there, and I made a reference to the movie Willow from like 1988. And everyone here is nodding their heads and knows what I'm talking about. But none of the parents at the party knew. And so we went around, and surprisingly, other than one of the parents' dads, the grandpa who joined, I was the oldest person at the party besides grandpa. No one knew what Willow was. But let's rewind. Let's go to those younger years. 2 questions. I am a young athlete. I'm training, and I'm trying to build as much muscle as possible. What would your recommendation be? And now I'm in my 40s. Each year that goes by, I'm a little bit older. How would those recommendations change?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I use myself as a template. When I was young, I had all kinds of time. So I spent a lot of time in the gym. And I think my workouts probably involved a lot of chatting with a lot of other people. And just probably burning a lot of time in there that I didn't need to burn. So there was a lot of sitting around between sets. I thought rest and recovery were key and important to go with the next set. And I could work out 6-7 days a week, and nothing stopped me because I was young enough that you could recover and regenerate. The older I get, the less time I have. So I don't spend time in between sets, and I don't do near the volume that I did, and I can probably lift. I don't lift heavy really anymore, not nowhere near as heavy as I did when I was young, and I do less of it. So and the goal is more about being able to move around the next day and being able to lift the day after that. So I tend to lift sort of every other day and probably hit it about 3 or 4 times a week. So I think I'm still doing all right, but I'm a shadow of my former self. I don't know if that's good advice. That's just the way I think it's worked for me, and I think that's probably generalizable to most folks out there. So my question to Ted, who asked the question about the aging, is to say, is that in line with what you think? And as you look like you spent a few years under the bar. You'll forgive me for guessing how many, but what do you think? What's your take on that?
Well, I would say, historically, 55 and over has been usually what older is. But since I'm older than that, I don't view that as being old. But I do sort of to follow up what Ernie said, say nutritionally, with the protein research that you and your lab have done, what would your advice been to you when you were 25 versus to what you are now in terms of would those same guidelines be consistent?
Yeah, I mean, I think the luxury of being young and active and everything is that it almost didn't matter what you ate. Things changed. Like you seemed to always be making progress. I probably, when I was younger, could have stood to eat better, cut out a lot of the garbage food that I, was part of the staple of what I ate. Like nutrition when I was younger wasn't as big an issue, but these days I kind of like to tell people to eat about twice the recommended dietary allowance. So it's about 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, works out to about 0.7 grams of protein per pound or thereabouts. You can go up to 1 gram per pound if you're, so inclined. I just think things begin to become much smaller in terms of benefit the more you creep above about 0.7. These days, I'm probably hitting close to 0.7, but I do it more through my diet than I did. If I were a younger person, I have 3 young sons. They're big into the supplements and that's how they get their protein. And I'm just more careful about the food that I prepare. So it probably has changed a little bit, but when I was younger, it was, you could get away with a lot of things. Now, if I eat like that, I probably weigh about 300 pounds. So I couldn't do it.
To follow up on that, you mentioned about 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight, and talk to us a little bit about the timing of eating protein and how that affects muscle protein balance.
Yeah.
I
mean,
yeah, go ahead.
I think it's fair to say that, exercise sets your muscle up to be more receptive to just about everything, from carbohydrates to restoring muscle glycogen to amino acids to making new muscle protein. So it's probably true that, there is a window, so to speak, where it's a good idea to get nutrients on board. There's no question about that. I think one of the things that's evolved in terms of my understanding of, timing per se, is that window post-exercise is much bigger and longer than we ever thought it was. So it's, I read a review recently from another group that said it's instead of a post-exercise window, it's more like a garage door. So it's open, it's big, it's for a long time. And I'm beginning to subscribe more and more to that viewpoint, particularly for protein, is that your muscle is sensitive to the effects of protein, probably for upwards of at least 24 hours. So it's not as critical that so the guys who are walking around with the shaker full of, whey protein or something like that, that's probably above and beyond what you need. So I'm not sure whether that's a bad thing. It just means maybe the obsession about it is, not as big as we once thought it was. So, and I don't know, Pat, I'll ask you whether you think that that's the same as what people are doing out there. Like, I mean, I can see the gear in the background. So obviously you've got a vested interest. I mean, are people walking around with these shakers still, or is that something I'm imagining? I spend less time in big commercial gyms because my basement has become my gym. So
The same here. I do get a chance to walk through some of our athletic facilities, and I know our nutrition staff really pushes post-workout calorie replacement. I don't know if they're pushing protein so much as we used to, 10, 15 years ago. It was the shaker bottle, how much protein. I do know that we do some individualized shakes for athletes now in the weight room. And so based on their needs, if they need to gain weight, lose weight, I think that's taken into consideration in their post-workout recovery. But we know they can go and undo everything that was done in about 5 minutes if they drive down the street and stop at McDonald's or somewhere else. I think, something that I'm more interested in is, and I would like to ask you this because people ask me these questions. If someone wants to be more plant-based, how do you recommend they go about doing that? And what is plant-based? Does it mean it's your base of everything, or is it plant only? Because when I hear people say, I'm plant-based, and then you hear more and it's like, no, that sounds like plant only. It's plant-based. What is that? Help me out. I've got a lot of questions there.
Yeah, no, a great question. I mean, I don't know if I know what plant-based means. I think for most people, they broadly say I'm cutting out, and they'll say meat, and I say, so like all meat, and they say, well, red meat, and I'm like, okay, so chicken's good, and they're like, oh yeah, I eat a little bit of chicken, and and I eat fish, and so I'm like, well, I guess you're eating more plant than you were if you're cutting out red meat and substituting in whatever it is, an Impossible Burger or something like that. When people are like, yeah, there's no meat, there's no red meat, there's no chicken, there's no fish and everything. And generally my next question is, so milk and eggs? And they're like, no, I don't do that. Then to me, you're vegan. And that's a tough transition for most people to make if you've spent time planning your meals around where it's sort of, traditional. There's a piece of meat, there's a protein served, there's some starch, and then there's some vegetables on your plate or something like that. To make that transition is tough because people generally don't have the skills to be able to choose the right foods and cook them in ways that make it, I won't say palatable, but not boring. The landscape's changed though a little bit. There are a lot more products that are out there beyond meat and all kinds of things where, and I want to say, hand on heart, they taste a whole lot better than they used to. So it's maybe getting easier to do that, but I still don't understand what plant-based means. I think it means you've subbed something out of your diet, and let's be honest. Again, my understanding and stance in this has changed a little bit. I used to say, that's not the right way to go. You don't want to do that. You're going to be short on amino acids. You're going to be short on, the right things. And I think that's not as true as it once was, probably because of the proliferation of products that is out there, that people can choose from that, even as little as, 5 or 10 years ago, they just weren't there. And so if it wasn't soy or soy based, and now a lot of people are like, I don't do soy either. And I'm like, wow, like what do you eat? And, but there's a lot of choice. And I've had the pleasure of working with some very, very good athletes, and they eat almost pure plant-based diets. And because or in spite of what they do, but the bottom line is they still perform very well. So I think it's a state that's possible. It's not what I choose to do, but I respect people who make that decision, and driven a lot by concerns that are beyond nutrition, related to environmental impacts and all kinds of things, and religious reasons. Things that just weren't on my radar when I was younger. But I respect those decisions for sure. I don't know whether that's something that other people see happening, or I'll just throw it open. I mean, is that, I'm just talking probably about I live on a university campus pretty much, about what I see, but, is that, I don't know whether that's the outside world or not.
I know a few of the NFL teams I've talked with. One team, the wife of one of the players was, convincing everybody they need to go vegan. And so several of the players did. And some of these guys were linemen. Now, they may have had more of a healthier blood profile, but they're
Yeah.
losing way too much weight to be competitive at their sport. So not that it wasn't healthy, but it wasn't allowing these particular players to play out of weight that was necessary for them to be competitive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the movie Game Changers had a big impact on people's perception of, what was the right thing to do. And, the point I always make to people when they say, well, remember that guy in the movie, like he looked pretty big. And I'm like, you're right. He was, but it is more difficult to get the amount of protein that you need and, not the energy per se, but you have to eat a lot of energy to get the type of protein that probably guys that size need. But if you're judicious about it and you plan it well, you can do it. But I agree, Ted. I think that there are some folks who would have a tough time with that for sure.
Yeah. Just to take it a little bit further, Stuart, for someone that is trying to be healthier, and we may say, well, don't eat as much fast food or fried foods. We have to tell them what to eat.
Yeah.
So what's your suggestion for someone who maybe they were getting a lot of their protein from not as healthy sources, but they've watched the movie, whatever it may be. What are some things you would tell them to make sure that they might want to look at to substitute?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk to athletes and when I spend time with athletes, I try to teach them how to shop. I find that that's one of the biggest barriers. And it's almost like pretty much anywhere in North America where you can go to, like, I find it interesting to go to other countries and walk around their supermarkets, and they're all laid out relatively similar in that the outside of the store tends to be up. One side is produce, so fruits and vegetables. And then you've got sort of meat and dairy or something like that. And you've generally got, a bread aisle or grains or something like that. The trouble happens when you go up and down the aisles. And, for the most part, at least in just about any grocery store in North America, that's where the highly processed, refined foods, they taste great. They're probably not that good for you. And it's hard to turn them down, right? That's where the chips are, that's where the cookies are, et cetera, et cetera. And a bunch of athletes go, well, that's where the rice is too. And I'm like, okay, well, so the rice aisle is fine, I got it. And the pasta aisle, that's good too. But it's also where, these, what we call energy dense, nutrient poor foods come from. And, every year somebody says there's been 800 new foods added in a grocery store. And I'm like, 800, how is that even possible? Well, it's not like we grew 800 new vegetables or we have 800 new cuts of beef or pork or chicken or whatever it is. It's created manufactured products that are in those middle aisles that are some new cereal or a new cookie or a new snack or something like that, that people who are food scientists work very hard to make taste delicious. So I say to most athletes, like, try and spend as much time on the outside and eat quote unquote real food. In other words, it shouldn't have a long ingredient list. And I know that that's a little bit trite, but I do think it bears some consideration to, when you're talking to athletes, it's about simplifying the message. And but if you're bent and determined it's got to be plant-based, then most of the new sort of, I'll call them meat alternatives are, for the most part, they're processed. I don't know if that's a bad thing or not, but it certainly has made it easier for people to make the transition, because you give them a lump of tofu and they're like, well, what do I do with this? So you got to learn how to cook that. It's not an easy thing to do. And but if you have a Beyond Meat burger, well, that's a burger, and I know how to grill a burger or whatever. And it's not an impossible transition to make. So I do think that, nuts, seeds, there are now, a massive dairy alternative market. There are In Canada, we're not allowed to call them milks, actually. So they're beverages, but in the States, I know it's a little different. There are soy milks, and there are almond milks, and there are rice milks, and there are, you name it. There's oatmeal milk, or I think they call it something else, but like it's an oat beverage that's designed to be milk-like. Not my favorite. It's not exactly what I would choose, but there you go. Is that the way you see it, Pat? I mean, I don't know whether that's the right type of advice, or is that too simplistic, or what's the deal?
No, I think that's great. I think shopping, teaching them how to shop, teaching them how to cook, just the basics. If you can just learn the basics of cooking, that way you don't have to shop in the middle of the store and look for what's already cooked, and you just have to put in the microwave and hit the express button a few times. If we can, there's so much information out there right now. There's so many opportunities, options. I think the whole plant-based conversation, I just had questions like, what is plant-based? Like, is it really plants that are in what you're eating? Like, did you read the ingredients? Like, and if it can sit on the shelf that long, how is that healthier than something that's fresh? My great grandmother she grew up on a farm. She lived on a farm. She lived to be 102 years old. Yeah. And she would talk about the reason why she didn't have any issues is everything she ate came from within a few hundred yards. Yeah. She fished until she was almost 100, I believe. She using lard is something that, oh my God, that's got to be the most unhealthiest thing ever. And she used lard every day, but there was nothing processed in that. There were no hormones fed to the cows. And so I just question what we say is healthy. She was one of the way her mind worked and where her body worked until she was past 100. I can't imagine living that long and being that functional. So I just question some of what we see and hear.
Yeah, that's definitely career longevity for sure. I mean, that's the only thing I say to young athletes when they seem to be able to do everything. I said, you know what we're teaching you now, these are the fundamental foundation pieces for you to have a long career. And that's about the only time I find they pay attention, because they want to be able to do that. And I say, you know what, you get this right early on, it'll pay dividends. Because most athletes, once they've been in a game for a while, they just learn either how to eat or what not to eat, or what to do and what not to do. I can't imagine playing football into your 40s, but now there's a few guys out there that are doing it, and that's something else to watch. So yeah, career longevity, and then once you retire, it's obviously the horizon takes off in the distance. So yeah. So Ernie, you got a few more years yet. You got to figure it out, but with the right foods and the right exercise, you'll probably be okay.
Thanks. You were talking about grocery shopping. That made me think of something. So I want to throw a question over to Pat and then over to Ted. I'd be curious, like at the Power 5 collegiate athletics level, there's a lot of resources. We have dietitians, we have like sports nutrition staff, lots of dietitians. We have fueling stations, dining halls. My question for Dr. Ivey, based on his experience working in different Power 5 institutions and with your network, is what percentage of our athletes actually go grocery shopping on a regular basis? And to pitch that over to Ted, with all your consulting in the NFL, how much time do those performance staffs focus on teaching athletes, their players, how to grocery shop?
Yeah, wow. I would say, just in my experience, if 10% of your athletes went grocery shopping, I don't think it's 20%. I don't think it's 25%. So I'm thinking about myself and some of my teammates. And, I don't think it's more than 25%. It's probably around that 10, 15%. I'm getting some confirmation from Stuart. He's shaking his head up and down. So I don't know yeah, that's my answer.
And to pitch that over to Ted, like, if that's
Well,
true,
yeah, I think NFL teams are doing a much better job of getting the spouses and girlfriends of the players on board with educating them on what to buy and what to cook, cooking lessons. You're finding more players that will hire, because really they have breakfast and lunch at the facility. And most of them they'll team them up with like a personal chef that has their meals all prepared for them. So in terms of players going out grocery shopping themselves, I don't think it's a high percentage, but they try to spend more time and attention educating the girlfriends and spouses. And I would say a good portion, as soon as they leave the facility, they'll go and pick up their food, from their chef, or their chef delivers it. It's about, being time efficient.
how nice that must be.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not how mere mortals make their food, for sure. I think that's true. It transcends sports, like beyond football. If you go to NBA facilities, or if you're at the top level of the NHL, the goal is to get the athlete actually to spend as much time and eat in the facility, because you lose control once they leave, right? So it's let's get them while we've got them here and do what we can do with them, because particularly when they're young, they don't always make the best decisions once they leave the facility. That's the main issue. So
Yep. Ernie, I can tell you my experience, and this was many years ago, as a professional athlete. We didn't have dining halls. I was with 4 different teams. There wasn't a dining hall. You were lucky if the team catered food in. And if they did cater it in, it would be lunch. I remember stopping by Burger King for breakfast and Subway for lunch to balance out the Burger King for breakfast. And to me, that was about as good as you could get. And double portion of the protein on the Subway sandwich, and the multi-grain bun. And then for dinner, it was hopefully you add a salad to whatever you ate, and that was as good as it got. So it's changed hiring personal chefs.
So you go from educating athletes to learn how to navigate the grocery store, to educating athletes on learning how to navigate the dining hall, in a way, because if they're not shopping and they're not preparing their own food, then it comes down to a different level of education, I suppose.
Yeah. I have a question for Stuart. From the research that you've done, and I've looked at a little bit of the research you've done, what projects or research projects that you've been a part of that you think have been most impactful in your career?
yeah, I mean, probably there's 1 or 2 paradigms that we've pushed back against that were pretty ingrained in the way people thought, that I think I want to say we've undone a little bit, if maybe that's the right way to put it. One of them was there was a big obsession, like for a really long time, with measuring acute post-exercise changes in anabolic hormones, so testosterone, growth hormone, insulin-like growth factor. And people said, the more those go up, the better or the more effective the workout is, because those rises in hormones drive the process of muscle growth. And we pushed that paradigm around a number of different ways. We really tried to exploit that rise in hormones as if it was mechanistically linked to muscle growth, and we just didn't see it. Like when we tried, I think we manipulated enough conditions, enough variables to, in my mind anyway, say that measuring that post-exercise rise in anabolic hormones is it's inconsequential as to the effectiveness of the workout that you've just had. So, I don't know if that's, certainly there are some people who still don't think that that's the case. They think that there's still merit in measuring these hormones. But, to me, that's something that we changed. I think we changed some people's minds on that one. And the other one is about the utility of lifting lighter weights. And the thought is almost blasphemous to talk about now, but, we would regularly get comments from reviewers of our work in peer review as to, why we didn't have these guys lift heavier weights or these women lift heavier weights. And we would say, well, if you lift lighter weights, but you lift them to the point of momentary muscular failure or fatigue, the size principle, which is dictating how many motor units you get engaged, says that you should be driving maximal recruitment of your motor units. And again, we've pushed that one around, and I don't know how many people's minds we've changed. I think that if the National Strength and Conditioning Association is any indication, I'm told that their guidelines will acknowledge that you can get muscle growth by lifting lighter weights and heavier weights. In other words, both work. But if you want to lift, if you want to get people strong, there's no doubt you have to lift heavier weights. And we never talked about strength being the primary outcome. Like the idea of specificity says that if you want to be stronger, lift things that are heavier. In other words, a great football example is if you want to get better at the combine, you train to do the combine. You can do other things, but you emphasize those exercises. So if you want to get better at doing a 1RM, then lift weights that are close to your 1RM. And I think that that's the easiest way to put it. So I'd like to think we've changed some people's minds, and I don't know that we've flipped paradigms. I hate, saying we went out with the intention of trying to upset people by doing what we did, but we certainly, we thought, what these things they're not right the way that they're written, and they deserve to be challenged and to be changed. And that's what science is. I change my mind on things, and it frustrates people. And I always make the point, I'm like, well, I wouldn't be a decent scientist if I wasn't able to change my mind when presented with new evidence. So, but I'll say flat out that weightlifting and spending time in gyms and the dark arts of getting big and getting strong are held, in the hands and the minds of a lot of people that it's like, well, this has worked for me. And I'm like, well, that doesn't mean it's the only way it can work. It's a way, and maybe it's a good way, but it's not the only. And so I don't know if that fits with your paradigm or what people think, or that makes people go like, is this guy talking about, so I don't know. What do you
I remember reading
Go ahead.
a research article. It was in the mid 70s in Med Science, Sports and Exercise, mechanisms of work-induced muscle hypertrophy by Goldberg. And so for the listeners there, they castrated the subjects, took out the pituitary, and trained them.
Yeah.
And noticed that, the real
these were rodents, just for everybody's
rodents.
reference. Yeah, it's
Yep.
tough to get ethics approval for that, to do that in humans. But no, they're rodents. You're right.
The ethics approvals the new ethics approvals hadn't passed yet.
Yeah, we've updated the rules. Yeah.
But I remember that was the first study I read that looked at the mechanisms that truly, the need for a muscle to grow if it's stimulated are very strong, minus hormonal intervention.
Yeah, no, I'd agree 100%. I think that the pushback we get when we show our data is that people say, but steroids work. And I'm like, oh, absolutely they do. And but here's the daily variation in your testosterone level, and here's what happens when you take steroids. You're 2 to 3, 4 standard deviations beyond what we can normally produce. And our levels go up and down, up and down, up and down all throughout the day. And they don't when you're taking an exogenous steroid. Like they're up, and for as long as you're taking the steroid, and depending on the type, or it's oral, you keep dosing with it, and it's not the same paradigm to compare the two. And the biggest pushback I've had lately, like half of my graduate team here are women, and they're pretty muscular. And if testosterone was such a big deal, what's making the muscles in these women grow? Now, I get it, they're not as big as the guys, but relatively speaking, from the muscle that they have, they can gain about the same percentage. So guys gain 10%, the women gain 10%. The women are just smaller to start with, but so it can't be testosterone. But yeah, like Fred Goldberg's work is that's some classic biology and biochemistry there for sure.
It's too bad it wasn't Bill Goldberg's work. But in all seriousness, though, you're talking about, you had mentioned the post-exercise changes in anabolic hormones, and then you mentioned that testosterone will fluctuate through the day. It's pretty common to do fasted blood panels, especially in the healthcare setting. Yeah. But in the performance setting, blood panels and going beyond your traditional metabolic panel have become quite popular. Mm-hmm. So what are protocols that need to be put into place if you want to get a panel on your anabolic hormones? Is it fasted? Is there a certain time of day to be able to get more stable results with less variance? And to go even further, maybe the question is really like, what kind of benefits do you see from these more comprehensive blood panels that have become popular both commercially and within sports organizations? And then what kind of concerns do you have around it?
So I'll start off with the first one. I mean, the reason when you go into the lab for whatever measure it is and overnight fasted, and you're grumpy because you didn't get to drink your cup of coffee or whatever, that's when things tend to be most stable. They're not under the outside influence of something you've eaten or something like that. So clinically, that's relevant. Definitely, when we're sleeping, growth hormone goes up. We've known that for a long, long time. And in young guys, that's when testosterone spikes as well. And, probably young boys going through puberty are well aware of the side effects of that. So, sleep's a regenerative time. That sort of goes in line with the hormonal idea. But then the net exposure is quite long as opposed to the short period right after exercise. Moving over to the other question you asked about these panels, I'm a healthy skeptic on their use, what they will ultimately, the information that they would give to an athlete or coach, as to how the athlete would use that information. I've yet to see a good study that's carried out with sort of what people call unbiased analysis, where we can get thousands of these metabolites and hormones, and then feed that back to an athlete and have the athlete go, that's the reason. It's not there yet. With the advent of the ability to process massive volumes of data, and we're getting it in various metrics in sports there, and gambling and all kinds of things, so we're getting there with the ability to process this really complex data and maybe begin to see trends that are, I'll say, 5-10 years down the road would say to an athlete, something's happening here, and you either better back your training off, or something's happening here, you need to do more, or what's going on, like something like that. But I still do think, when you talk to coaches and trainers and everything in a variety of different professional sports, and you say, what would be most helpful? and they, like to predict an injury if it was going to happen, or to predict under or overtraining or something, it still comes back, if you ask them, they say, how's the athlete feeling? Where do they score? If 1 out of 10 is feel like crap, and 10 out of 10 is I feel like $1 million. And there are lots of validated scores like that. And the trainers and coaches will say that actually, if you can get your athletes to be honest with you and trust you, is as good an indicator of what you can expect from your athlete as anything else. So, the panels are great. People love new things. Yeah, maybe something will happen, but right now I'm not as enthused. I don't know whether, either Pat or Ted, whether you guys have found like, this is in use at the higher levels of sports. I don't do enough work with other sports beyond, like, maybe I touch hockey and a little bit of basketball every now and again, but nothing on a regular basis. Whether are people using these tests?
I don't see a large scale. I think there was a group out of Ireland, company, and they'll say we're doing work at the NFL or NBA. It could be one person, and they'll say it's the NFL or the NBA. But in terms of large scale utilization, no. Because usually, if you're honest with your player and telling them why they got cut or why they're not playing, it has really nothing that whatever they're eating is not the rate limiting factor in them not playing. It's usually their ability. And sometimes that's hard for people to understand, that there's, you have to be skilled, and you could be the, best fed, best rested player. But if you're not as talented as somebody that's, eating McDonald's 3 times a day, that person's playing.
Yeah, which is the frustrating part. And I do say this to a number of athletes, and my analogy is it's tough to make a thoroughbred out of a nag racehorse. They like you feed them the best feed and hose them down afterwards. You can put the best jockey on their back, but and people go, well, we're not horses. And I'm like, but the genetics and picking, you can pick your mom and dad wisely if you're a horse, right? Or a horse breeder. Unfortunately, it's a birth lottery for most individuals, and good nutrition will, never make a guy like me. I'll never be able to make it. I gave up a long time ago on my NHL dreams, but that's the way it goes. Is that talent and athleticism are always going to win, and all that nutrition does is allows good people to exploit that, if that's the right way of saying it.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Marshawn Lynch doing a shot of Jameson before he got on off field. So,
yeah,
people say, what was his pregame hydration strategy? You do a shot of Jameson.
Yeah, there, and maybe that's the frustrating part for some athletes, is to say, as you look at that and you're like, how do you get away with that? And I've been surprised a couple of times in pro sports to be around athletes that have phenomenal talent, and then you talk to the people who talk to them about nutrition, and they're like, yeah, like whatever, and Jameson, or the partying that they do. You think if they only could do this, but they're able to perform even in a state that would floor most mere mortals. And so that's frustrating for other people who work their butts off and don't have the talent. I know.
Yeah, I know DK Metcalf came out and said that, his diet consists of candy and I don't know, fast food. Something. And then you look at him, there's no one more physically impressive than him. And then if you replay probably one of the most played videos, was it last year or the season before, where he walks this athlete down.
Yeah.
And like, this guy's just a physically impressive person. An athlete that I coached, who's one of the best athletes he had the vertical jump record. He ate McDonald's 3 times a day. And eventually it may have caught up with him. He did suffer a significant knee injury. And it was more than once. And I know as strength coaches, we would say, well, it's because of his diet.
Yeah.
That's it. It was the, the 3 times a day fast food caught up to him. But where he was above everyone else, just remarkable that you could get to that level with going against the advice we were giving them every day.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that, because I was part of a group. We wrote a position stand for the International Olympic Committee. It's a great, you get a gig with the IOC. It's a pretty good gig, right? And they bring you over to Lausanne in Switzerland, which, it's a beautiful place to hang out for a few days and, be in the lap of the IOC and sit around with all these experts and sort of debate supplements and things that, the IOC never wanted to talk about. And we sort of came out with a really short list of things that would enhance people's performance. And even then, it's a pretty thin slice. And one of the opening lines that one of the people that wrote the stance, it was, nutrition can have an effect on an athlete's performance, but it's probably a small effect. And the number of people who just lost their minds over that statement, they were like, that's not true. Nutrition is everything. And I was like, I don't know. In certain sports, I get it. Like, you can't be an Ironman triathlete and eat a McDonald's, I don't think. But you can certainly be an athlete in a lot of other sports and not have optimal nutrition. So it depends, sport dependent, but a lot of pro team sports, people defy the odds all the time. And it's just sheer talent and good genes that have made up for something that probably isn't where you need it or want it to be.
I've got a question, and I had a chance to meet Ted, a few months back, and I could say, okay, here's an example of a stud. I want to be like Ted, physically, like, put together. And what advice would you give someone, that you're in your mid 40s? I'm older than that, but you want to live a healthy life. What does the research say at this point? What do you say?
Yeah, I'm a do more. I'm an activity guy to talk about the benefits of that. So I always say to people that first try and maintain a fairly lean body, whatever that is. I mean, and you don't need to be 4 or 5% body fat, but try not to gain 30, 40, 50 pounds, which is not uncommon between age 20 to age 40, age 50. That's not a good thing to do. Next, be as active as possible. And that includes, being strong, which I think, and muscle retention, because, I think what muscle is, and people don't really look at it this way, it's our functional reserve. In times of stress, and, the pandemic was a great one, and people were committed to hospital if they got a respiratory infection. If you can draw on muscle, that's what you need to draw on. If you don't have a lot of muscle, or if you're weak, it's really tough to come back from those. When you're younger, no problem. You go down, you come back up. When you're older, it doesn't happen. It probably represents a permanent loss. So being as fit as you can, doesn't mean you're having to run marathons, but being pretty aerobically fit, and then being strong. And I think we've undersold the importance of resistance training. And I'm sure you guys would probably subscribe to that viewpoint, but I think in some point in your life, you need to be strong or stronger. And so where you don't want to be is, if this is the top quartile of people that are strong, you don't want to be down the bottom. Things hit you, age-related, I'll call them diseases or conditions, syndromes, a lot harder when you're close to the bottom in terms of physical mobility or strength. And so, the eating part, I get it. Eat whole foods, if that's the right way to say it, the outside of the grocery store, and be as physically active as you can. And the last part, which is always tough to wrap your mind around, I'm convinced that having purpose in your life, and if that's your church, your religion, great. If that's a a group of friends, awesome. If whatever it is that somebody, there's value to you as part of this association, and feeling that you're part of something and there's a reason for you to keep going. And you know, when you put those things together, I think it's pretty, I mean, it may not live to be 100, but I think you're going to live pretty well. And we talk a lot more now about health span as well as lifespan, because we've added 30 plus years to people's lives in the last century, but we haven't added 30 years of good health to people's lives. So we can keep people alive under a very, I would call it, poor quality of life, with drugs and treatments and all that sort of stuff. So you want to try and avoid, you know, those chronic diseases that are really going to lower your quality of life. So
Your group's done a significant amount of research with interval training.
yeah.
And once again, I recall back, this was hypothesized when I was in graduate school 40 years ago, that we knew interval training was extremely important and beneficial, but it was hypothesized that it could probably induce better central adaptations than originally thought, perhaps due to the effects of increasing stroke volume greater because of the effects of reactive hyperemia. Could you expand upon that?
Yeah, great question. And I'll be honest, it's not my work. It's my good friend and colleague, Marty Gabala, who is, he's the head interval guy. You know, it's interesting to, you know, you say you changed, you hit on something that's really important. Like, I used to think, like, if I had 20 minutes, I would think, what a waste of time. Why would I put my shorts on, my shirt on, and get a workout for 20 minutes? It's worthless. You can't do it. And I've changed my mind a lot. So I credit my friend Marty Gabala for that. He showed me the light on that one and what you can get done at a high intensity, and even, you know, something as simple as sprinting up and down stairs. The hyperemia question, this is the one I'm going to answer based on my 25 year long association with my wife, who's a cardiovascular physiologist. And you're probably right, is that, you know, there's some sort of volume expansion and the heart is adapting well to that. And that's probably emphasized in the higher intensities of exercise that you're doing. So I'd agree with that. I think what we're beginning to hone in on now is actually the dose that you need to see benefits for, you know, just about every exercise, as long as it's intense enough, is actually pretty small. And so, you know, HIIT and interval training is an example of that. You know, quick circuit workouts where people, you know, get some really impressive gains that I would have thought, you know, years ago, you'd need to spend 3, 4, 5 times as much time in the gym. So I've been impressed with the short and compressed workouts that people are able to do and see something that's pretty beneficial in my books.
That makes me feel really good. You know, as you know, not having the amount of time in the weight room, and sometimes maybe there's 30 minutes in between a meeting, and hopping over to the basketball weight room or the football weight room or Olympic sports weight room and getting a quick one in, or quick workout in the morning or at night. Don't have at one point we used to spend 2 hours on bench press, you know, and if I spend 2 hours a month on bench press, that's good for me. You know, just at different points, I'm at a different point in my life. So I always like to kind of begin with the end in mind. And so I like to know where I'm going and what I can be doing right now. So that's why it's important to know, you know, from a food standpoint, where are things going? What should we be thinking? It's a lot of information out there. What are some things, some other myths that you would like to, if you could, undo and have us thinking more along the lines of you know, what you experienced through your research and something else?
Yeah, I mean, the one that, you know, always comes to mind, if you're a guy that talks about protein, as soon as you mention it, and as soon as you mention higher protein, and so I'm talking about intakes that are twice the current recommended dietary allowance or intake, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I could walk away from science and say, I think things have gotten better if we change the name from recommended dietary allowance to minimal dietary intake. So first, I don't think it should be recommended, and I definitely think you should be allowed to eat more. So the name is, in and of itself suggests that it's like this is some sort of theoretical upper limit, and to go beyond it is just, there are diabolical consequences. The biggest is probably the higher protein causes kidney damage or kidney failure, and that's now almost a 60-year-old hypothesis. People would call it the Brenner hypothesis after Dr. Brenner, who basically said that the work that your kidneys have to do to get rid of protein related, I'll call them toxins, but urea being the primary one, but other compounds too, eventually causes your kidney to become fatigued, and there's dropout of the functional units in your kidney, and so protein causes. What I point out to people is that all of the work that's done in that area is done on animals. And so when we looked, and we looked really hard, did what they call a systematic review for evidence of this effect in trials. So where diets are manipulated and we're looking for a causal, high uroprotein is associated with a decline in kidney function, you can't find it. It doesn't exist. So then the next possibility is you look for observational. You're looking for association. People with higher intakes have a greater incidence of kidney failure and that sort of thing. And again, it's not there. So you're then in a situation where you have absence of evidence, and everybody says, oh, well, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. And I'm like, that's true, but we've lived with this hypothesis for 60 years now. Maybe it was wrong. Maybe it's not as big a deal as we once thought. And that would be the one that, if textbooks changed, and they haven't, despite my letter writing campaign, which I gave up years ago, that message, and said the evidence for this is weaker than we thought, or is, there's just really no good, then I could walk away a happy man, that's for sure. And I don't know whether that's something, Ernie, I don't know whether do you hear that? Like, I mean, it's almost impossible to get past it. Like everybody, oh, it's going to cause your kidney, and then sometimes they throw in the liver as well. And I don't know where the liver comes from, but it's a brown internal organ that people vaguely remember has something to do with protein metabolism. So
I've heard it for years.
Yeah.
And when you start to dive into the research like yours, you can learn that to maximize, muscle hypertrophy, you probably need a little bit more protein. And earlier you said, I work at a university. Is that really what the outside world is talking about? And it kind of goes into this idea of the level of expertise we have in faculty at universities, and how hard it is to get their research to the outside world, and to people to adopt the research that's being done as, changes in life and in practice. I've seen you present twice, and after seeing you present at the 76ers event a couple of years back,
yeah.
I always try to go, like, if I'm going to listen to someone who knows something, when I go back to work on Monday, I really want to try to find a way to bring what I learned to real life practice. So I don't know if you remember, but we emailed back and forth, and Lisa, the dietitian at my previous institution, Utah, and we started actually educating athletes on your findings. So my question for you is, I'm going to tell you what we started to educate on. We had some cool visuals and graphics, but I'd love to maybe just throw that at you.
Sure.
Maybe you can clarify if that has changed, or maybe even correct what we were teaching our athletes. Just literally, this presentation was last given to college football players in February of 21. So this isn't that old. So what we would recommend is that you want to eat protein every 3 to 4 waking hours. And to try to hit those benchmarks, like you said, like that minimum of 1.6, we would say you want about 0.3 grams per kilogram every 3 to 4 hours that you're awake. It doesn't matter as much when you eat it, as long as you get it every 3 to 4 hours. I mean, it doesn't have to be right before workout or right after. Before you go to bed, 0.5 grams per kilogram. And if you wanted to go to the store, maybe supplement with some leucine.
Yeah, 10 out of 10. No, I think too, like a lot of people email me and they say, oh, I'm just starting to work out. I'm like, go to the gym, do it regularly. That's the advice to you. Climbing into where you're talking about, Ernie, and talking to people at the top of their game and really looking like to squeeze out that last little part. All those recommendations are things that I would say are best practice. And, there's probably a few other things on the list, but as far as protein goes, I think you're hitting all the highlights there for sure. It'd be hard to, comment and somebody goes, I don't know if I'm getting enough protein. I'm like, are you following those guidelines, like to the T? Yes, I said, you're good. It's not protein that's the problem. So
it sounds like those emails were useful.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Ed?
Yeah, I'd like to, Stu, I'd like to, what books would you recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, good question. There's a book that I like. I give it to a lot of my students because I think it describes a lot about me. I don't think I'm a particularly smart person. I do okay, but I'm certainly everything I got in life. I have to work my butt off, and so I really like Grit. It's written by a psychologist named Angela Duckworth, and even in athletics, I coached for a number of years and worked with athletes, and so call it grit, determination, or the ability to be resilient, not giving up when things didn't work, and just being dogged in your determination to try and push forward. I realized pretty quickly that wasn't going to be me in any athletic scenario, but academically, I think that's been. And I say to people like I work with some great people, so and that's the key to success. People say, "What's the key?" And I'm like, surround yourself with people who are much smarter than you. They make you look good in their reflected hard work. But I say to my students, this book contains a lot of secrets, and they sort of think, well, can I change my grit or my grittiness? And I said, I think you can, but you got to work on it. And they go, okay. And I'm like, well, that's part of the secret, right? Is that science and life is oftentimes filled with crummy things. It doesn't always work out right, and the ability to persevere and go on. So that's a key one. I'm halfway through a book that my wife actually gave me called it's like something, Who Moved My Cheese, or Who Moved the Cheese, or something like that. And when I looked at it, and she showed me this, she goes, this was first published in 1998, and you're kind of like, wow, like, so this is something that's endured. It's an easy read. There's lots of pictures, so it really appeals to me. But the stuff I'm learning from it, I'm like, that's an incredible book about managing and leading, and there's lots of others. But I like Grit. I give it to a lot of students who are sometimes having a tough time, and I probably continue to do so. I can read that book backwards and forwards, and I really enjoy it. So.
Well, Dr. Phillips, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you spending some time with us and getting to know you a little bit better.
My pleasure.
Where can some of our listeners that are they watch this, they can hear it, they can access it in many different ways. How can they reach you?
So I am on social media, much to a lot of my colleagues' dismay. They go, why do you bother? And, my answer is quickly, that's where the people are. And I do like to try and get the message out. as MacKinProf. That's MacKinProf on Instagram and Twitter. I'm also on Facebook, SMP PhD. And if you type my name and say and McMaster University, you could probably find me on a lot of other places as well. I spent some time on LinkedIn. I'm told by my kids I'm too old to do TikTok, and old people ruin TikTok, so I don't go on there. And I've yet to figure out some of these other platforms, but I'm kept young by 3 sons who convinced me that I should be on these platforms because their friends even read and listen to what I have to say. So I'm breaking through with that age demographic, which are the millennials, and I'm told that I speak a different language, but they do somewhat listen to what I have to say. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to chat. It does mean a great deal to me to be able to have these types of conversations. So thank you.
Thank you
Enjoyed it.
very much. Yep. Take care. We appreciate
Thank you.
My pleasure. Take care, gentlemen. Stay well.